Well, what is to be done is inform a replica of what was done in the period following World War II. So the battle of the future, as it was in the post-war years, is for the establishment of social and economic rights more broadly. That is to say, more decommodification, more emphasis on tax reform to achieve a greater degree of equality.
Welcome to Perspectives, a journal of Canadian political economy and social democracy. My name is Clement Nokos, editor of Perspectives Journal and director of policy and engagement at the Broadbent Institute. In this interview, I'll speak with the legend himself, Ed Broadbent, founder of the Broadbent Institute, former leader of the New Democratic Party of Canada, and co-author of Seeking Social Democracy: 7 Decades in the Fight for Equality. Part memoir, part history, part political manifesto, Seeking Social Democracy offers the first full-length treatment of Ed Broadbent's ideas and remarkable 7-decade engagement in public life. In dialogue with 3 collaborators from different generations, Ed Broadbent leads readers through a life spent fighting for equality in Parliament and beyond, exploring the formation of his social democratic ideals, his engagement on the international stage, and his relationships with historical figures from Pierre Trudeau and Fidel Castro to Tommy Douglas, René Lévesque, and Willy Brandt. From the formative minority parliament of 1972 to 1974, to the contentious national debate over Canada's constitution, to the free trade election of 1988, the book chronicles the life and thought of one of Canada's most respected political leaders and public intellectuals, from his childhood in the 1930s in Oshawa to the present day. Ed Broadbent's analysis also points towards the future, offering lessons to a new generation on how principles can inform action and how social democracy can look beyond neoliberalism. The result is an engaging, timely, and sweeping analysis of Canadian politics, philosophy, and the nature of democratic leadership. You can order your copy today at seekingsocialdemocracy.ca. Ed, thanks for making the time to chat today to talk about your book for Perspectives Journal.
Graham, thank you very much for having me. I look forward to the future of the journal. It can play an important role in the politics of Canada, and I look forward to making a small contribution at this point.
Actually, Ed, I think to talk about your new book, Seeking Social Democracy, it's a pretty big contribution, because not only does it take a look at your remarkable life as a socialist, but it also engages with your social democratic ideas, formulating your thoughts on political economy in your academic career early on. It also looks at examples of your democratic socialist practice, from your start as an MP in Oshawa to become vice president of the Socialist International. And what's notable to me is that this book doesn't exactly resemble a traditional political memoir. It takes on something like a dialectical style or approach between you and your co-authors, Francis Abel, Jonathan Sass, and Luke Savage, who ask the questions about your thoughts and experiences that you respond to in the text. So how did your quartet come to write the book in this style, and how does it lend to elaborating on your thoughts on social democracy?
Well, I'd make 2 points about that. One is that I had always thought I would not want to produce an autobiography, because there's a perpetual mistake made by authors who do this, and I would be no exception. And that is to say, they get involved in justifying their past actions or criticizing their own critics from the past. And that's pretty hard to escape in the traditional format of an autobiography. So I wanted something different if I ever did write about my political past. And secondly, I always thought if I did it, I would want to discuss fundamentally the ideas or values that were reflected in my political past, as opposed to simply the details of the happening. And this possibility became very clear to me, as it did to my collaborators, in the format that was originally used by Timothy Snyder and Tony Judt. Snyder asked questions of Judt. Both are distinguished historians of ideas, and Judt replied and elaborated on his thinking in the answers. Well, we've attempted to do the same thing in this format, when these three interlocutors ask me certain questions about a particular period of the past, and I respond by stating what was involved for me as a Social Democrat or the NDP as a party. And that way we got, I think, a crisper, a more accurate view of the past, actually, than what would have emerged if I had just done a traditional autobiography. They literally question me and then have follow-up questions. So it's a good method to liven up, I think, the history of the past.
And in the dialogue, in Seeking Social Democracy, you dedicate an entire chapter to this idea of ordinary Canadians. And what comes to mind for me typically is something others also know as the working class. But you've stuck over the decades to an elaboration over ordinary Canadians. Who, in your view, are ordinary Canadians?
Well, generally speaking, when I use the phrase ordinary Canadians, which I did for a good part of my political life, it was a straightforward attempt in ordinary language to take into account the thoughts, feelings, aspirations, frustrations of the majority of Canadians. It was a very broad phrase used by me. And the only other point I would add at this juncture is that I wanted often to use the phrase ordinary Canadian to distinguish away from those who seek special privilege in the state. That's to say, an ordinary Canadian for me was someone who was quite content to accept his or her role as citizen, to pay taxes, to work hard, to spend time with family or friends. And this person was not, I repeat, the kind that would be seeking special privilege from the state. So there was that other notion, in addition to the income distribution of ordinary Canadians, there was, in my view, a disposition associated with them that made them feel simply as good citizens, going about their lives, not seeking special treatment or to work around existing rules to get an advantage.
Sticking with ordinary Canadians, you also talk at length about human rights, which you believe are fundamental things ordinary Canadians should have. How are human rights exactly important to ordinary Canadians?
Well, they have absolutely crucial interest in human rights, particularly in the human, economic, social, and cultural rights. They take as given, I would put it this way, the liberal heritage of political and civil rights, but they can also see that this in itself is insufficient for a good life, because you can have all the political freedom that the state can provide. But if you do not have a healthy situation, if you do not have a well-educated foundation to be able to exercise those rights, then they're not meaningful. So to give meaning to the political and civil rights in the first place, ordinary citizens need economic and social and cultural rights. So the freedom that came from the welfare state, particularly in that period, 1945 to 75, was the great emancipation for working class citizens, whether in Canada or elsewhere. During this period, they got the advantage of the security that comes from good pensions, that comes from universal health care, that comes from access to higher education, comes from also in a number of these states, well-provided housing. So you had this range of social and economic rights on top of political and civil rights that made a real difference in the lives of ordinary Canadians. And without these social and economic rights, life indeed would continue to be rather barren for the ordinary citizen.
And to the defense of ordinary Canadians, in the book, you chronicle the struggles you found as NDP leader in trying to develop Canada's industrial democracy through industrial strategy. You might say among the social democratic left today that there's been something of a revival in the idea of industrial policy as a tool for gearing economic transformation towards a just transition. You also talk about corporate power as well, how it's grown in the past 30 years in Canada. And I think if any industrial policy is to be considered, that corporate power needs to be checked. And in places with long traditions of industrial policy, corporate power is somewhat checked under a coordinated market economy system akin to what's typically seen in European advanced capitalist economies. These coordinated market economies see an institutional arrangement between corporate power and labor power and the state that's able to facilitate industrial policy, I think, far more effectively than Canada's liberal market economy is able to accommodate. And so, to that end, what is industrial strategy and industrial democracy in your view? And how does that relate with potentially calls for green industrial policy today, like the U.S. Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act?
Well, you begin with the question, to what extent are workers entitled to have democratic say in the corporate structure? This question was raised over the past 100 years with specific reference to the state, where the answer became very clear that for men and women to develop and indeed to flourish at all, they ought to have the political right of electing their own representatives and having access to the state and having representatives of the state responsible to them. That's what responsible democracy is all about. We have also had, during this past 100 years even, the question raised, well, if accountability is expected from those having power in the state, why should it not be expected of those who have power in the corporation? Because after all, for most men and women, the center of power, most influential on their lives on a day-to-day basis, is the corporation, or some kind of corporation, large or small. And it's that entity, as much as the state, that ought to be accountable in principle to the men and women over whom this power is being exerted. So the principle of industrial democracy really is a democratic principle that is applied to corporations and not simply left with reference to the state. And once you begin that, then I'm tempted to use a very vulgar phrase, the shit hits the fan. That is to say, the toughness of the situation will come out. And if the leadership is determined, they will be breaking some corporate traditions in order to make it feasible or practical to be talking about industrial democracy. That is to say, in the earliest years of the trade union movement, there was a claim that the powers that were being demanded by the unions were prerogatives of management. That, in fact, had been the case. And what the democratic demand was all about is democratizing these so-called prerogatives and make them claims of the people as well as claims of capital at the other end. And therefore, the men and women who make these demands, say, for example, to have a committee of workers running parallel to or part of the board of directors of a company concerned with the making of new major investments or changes in corporate structure by absorbing another company or by selling out to another company. These decisions should involve workers directly affected and not just corporate interests. And therefore, the workers themselves in different countries, in different industries, ought to shape what form of say or control they will have in such decisions in the future. The pace of change and the aspects of change should be determined by the workers themselves. And I repeat, will vary from country to country or within a country from one region to another. But the principle ought to remain clear that workers have to get beyond what they now have in terms of breaking down the prerogatives of management and have new says. The structure for this is in Germany, the corporate participation of co-determination, this one illustration that can be of what can be pursued, but it's only one, an important one. But the principle itself is something that we should be working for in Canada. And of course, the people that must determine this are the workers themselves.
You spend a great deal highlighting your internationalist work, building solidarity with socialists around the world, as vice president of the Socialist International during its heyday. This was especially a time to serve in the SI under the presidency of former German Social Democratic Chancellor Willy Brandt, and it was through that tenure I learned really through the Broadbent Institute's friends at the German Friedrich Stiftung, who I think of in a way as a grandfather to the Broadbent Institute, that you earned something of a legendary status among social democrats internationally. During the neoliberal apogee of the 1980s, you also existed in the world quite uniquely as a North American socialist. I also honestly don't think that most Canadians know you for your work in international affairs. So this was particularly an interesting chapter for me, from calling for democracy in Nicaragua to relations with Fidel Castro and working closely with the legendary Willy Brandt. It's clear you believed in internationalism for socialists, but why did you feel that this was important in the first place?
Well, the context is important. And during this period, you're quite right in singling out the importance of Willy Brandt, which a man that I had immense respect for. Willy, saw almost his role in life after he left the chancellorship in Germany to bridge the gaps, as he saw it often, between the authoritarianism of the USSR on the one hand and the rapid ideological capitalism of the United States on the other. And what he wanted to show to the world that there was a political option that rejected both of these outcomes, and that was social democracy or democratic socialism. Choose the label. He used them both interchangeably, as I do. And this became particularly important in the politics of South America, and even more practically relevant in Central America, where at the local level, battles were being fought out, literally using military means, often because of the repressive regimes. And the objective was to establish a beachhead for a social democratic state. This turned out to be, inclined to say utopian, but it turned out to be not a success. For example, the Americans were hostile to almost any formulation of social democracy, even in the battles that were being waged in Central America. They were only willing to accept in that, under immense pressure, a traditional liberal democratic state with no social and economic rights. And that was the American position on the one hand. And then, of course, those who were under the influence of the Soviet Union were interested in establishing a beachhead of radical authoritarian structures. These were thought to be by social democrats like Willy Brandt and myself to be unacceptable. So we attempted to aid and facilitate the development in whether it was Guatemala or Nicaragua or El Salvador, facilitate the development of social democratic parties. But it was very difficult indeed to avoid the extremism that was promoted directly and indirectly by forces outside Central America.
And it's through that anti-democratic tendency that we do see the decline of the Socialist International since your tenure, and the rise of the Progressive Alliance, made up of breakaway members of the SI, that doesn't really hold the same internationalist esteem as its predecessor. Do you think there's still hope or need for progressive internationalism today?
I think there is a great need for it, but the road ahead, to pursue another metaphor, is quite rocky indeed. There was a time when Brandt was the president of the SI that there was a widespread consensus even about what the initiatives globally should be all about. This is particularly true in the politics of Central America, but there's by no means such a consensus today. This, in part, is due, in my judgment, to the emergence of Blairism, and Tony Blair is a political figure in social democratic parties. He along with Gerhard Schroeder in Germany, promoted a view of social democracy that was almost indistinguishable from the capitalist party alternatives. By this, I mean they accepted too much the role of the market. The market was something that these conservative or right-wing social democratic parties had a worship of, and their continuing use of market mechanisms, including in elimination of a lot of public policy initiatives and turning them into joint ventures with the private sector, or simply relying on the private sector exclusively, abandoned in its effects social democracy. Social democracy came into being as a political movement concerned with well-being, indeed the emancipation of the working class, of working people. And under Blair's international leadership role, many, but by no means all, social democratic parties came to accept almost a complete domination of the market in terms of the organization of their own societies. And this led willy-nilly to serious ideological disputes within the SI. And I think the fallout since Brandt's death has been due to this right-wing move, as I see it, of the SI, that for many parties was not acceptable. And for those that were, this led to conflict and a lack of coordination for a system of global politics that would differ from the status quo.
An excellent resource I found in the back of the book were a collection of speeches and editorials that really lend to your rhetorical evolution as a politician and intellectual. It's very interesting to trace this evolution from a lecture you gave at York University before 1968 on the nature of political theory, to your NDP convention speeches as party leader, to the Broadbent principles of social democracy. What do you hope readers would learn from following along this section of the book?
Well, what I would hope it would illustrate is that there's some flexibility in social democratic thinking, and that the basic values of trying to build a society that's not overwhelmed by market mechanisms, that has a big role for the state apart from the market, that it's a road that necessitates different judgments at different times. There are unexpected occurrences that have to be dealt with, and there's no magic formula that will be provided to meet all circumstances. What I learned, I think, in my political life is that you have to be sure of rock solid values like the commitment to equality and the commitment to non-market mechanisms, that is to say, decommodification of a number of aspects of life, healthcare, life in the arts, job security. These aspects of life should not be marketized. That the goal of a social democratic party ought to keep those values in mind and apply them in different circumstances. But the outcomes will vary, just as the outcomes of the historical situation itself varies. So if the speeches and other material at the back of the book have any utility whatsoever, they should be in illustrations of an attempt from a social democratic point of view to make real progress. And that what should be copied is not the detail of the speech in question, but of the method or philosophy that lays behind it.
What I actually took from many of those excerpts and speeches, what I found particularly interesting was an original 1986 draft of an op-ed submitted to the Globe and Mail that listed a number of transgressions by the United States against Nicaragua. And this was put pen to paper even before the Iran-Contra scandal was revealed. Was this full article ever published before it was published in the back of Seeking Social Democracy? Why include it? And what was the reaction? Could you speak to the reaction you found from this idea of Canada lending diplomatic support to Nicaragua at the time?
Well, to answer one factual question, I don't know if it was ever published or not. That's why it was put in there in that form. I think it was requested of the Globe at one point, but whether it was printed, I don't know. And we didn't have time to check carefully enough before publication, but we thought the ideas in it were important to get into this book, because what's in it is the documentation of U.S. involvement in the politics of virtually every country in Central America, and almost invariably in a negative way, stretching the Monroe Doctrine all around the continent to get in place regimes that they would see to be quite sympathetic to their own set of political priorities. This is very harmful indeed to the development of these smaller countries to the south of us. And it was important for some of us, for many of us, to try to get created alternative approaches. Some like Costa Rica. Costa Rica has no military, just a police force, but no armed forces, and managed to produce two social democratic parties. Well, some of us had hoped this could become a pattern throughout Latin America, but even this form of social democracy or democratic socialism was unacceptable to the U.S. There were, during the Reagan years in particular, very prone to use force to stop this from happening. So what was happening there as a consequence was that on the one hand, there was some emphasis by groups on an approach that originated in the USSR, and then they're confronted by an American reactionary approach on the other hand. So it was difficult to get into this mix, a democratic socialist alternative, but that's what we were trying to achieve in that article that was critical of the U.S. and its early Nicaraguan policy. Stood as an example of what I thought was going on throughout the region. Nicaragua, as we all know, after the Sandinistas got power, they became very repressive and anti-democratic. But there was a stage before that happened, and the earliest stage of the overthrow of the old regime in Nicaragua, where the U.S., as well as social democratic governments in Western Europe and Canada, had cooperated and put persuasive pressure on the newly elected or formed Nicaraguan government. It could well have remained democratic, but as it turned out, because in part of outside pressure, but by no means entirely, the regime became quite repressive. However, I repeat, before this occurred, if the U.S. had shown more of an open attitude, there was some reason to believe a more democratic outcome in Nicaragua could have been achieved.
To wrap up, you nearly end the book with the age-old leftist question, what is to be done? In a postscript entitled The Good Society, a throwback to your dissertation on the democratic impulse of classic political economist John Stuart Mill. From your dissertation to the conclusion of Seeking Social Democracy, your hope is for a collectively owned economy that avoids exploitation to realize the good society. You then end the book by highlighting again West German Chancellor Willy Brandt and his historic struggle against the Nazis during his exile and then during his return to political life in Germany, contending with both denazification as well as East Germany. Brandt's struggle certainly reflects the struggles Social Democrats face today. But still, what do you think is to be done to realize the good society?
Well, what is to be done is inform a replica of what was done in the period following World War II, before this economic reaction set in with the Thatcher-Reagan period beginning in around 1980, prior to the reaction of the these two leaders, one in the UK and the other in the US, there have been great progress made in the 1945 to 75 period, when for ordinary people in many countries in Western Europe and North America, the coming of social and economic rights radically changed their lives. This was a profound alteration of the course of history, whereby ordinary citizens experienced commitment on pensions, commitments on health care, commitments on housing, commitments on employment insurance, all of which became rights of citizenship, not just aspirations, but rights of citizenship. So for a glorious period from 1945 to roughly 1975 or 80, these rights flourished in their development within the particularly developed European states and Canada and the Rooseveltian period in the US. But along came the Thatcher-Reagan movement that deliberately and consciously set out to destroy or roll back social democracy. Well, it succeeded. And so from 1980 on in particular, almost up to the present, but particularly to the crash of 2008, it was a rollback of the democratic state, and many of these rights were taken back. So my view would be that they have to be fought for again. They have to reestablish, instead of going on as the right wing would have us, so-called free speech movement associated with the convoys. It's anything but free speech. It's speech that would often lead to the taking away not only of political and civil rights, but speech that would take away, in particular, social and economic rights as well. Coming back of commitment by the state, and instead, I say we need an expansion of the role of the state, a decommodification. This will lead to the real freedom of more citizens in a way that simple political and civil rights would not. So the battle of the future, as it was in the post-war years, is for the establishment of social and economic rights more broadly. That is to say, more decommodification, more emphasis on tax reform to achieve a greater degree of equality.
Ed Broadbent, thank you for your time today.
It's been a pleasure.
That was Ed Broadbent, founder of the Broadbent Institute, former leader of the New Democratic Party of Canada, and vice president of the Socialist International. Once again, order your copy of Seeking Social Democracy at seekingsocialdemocracy.ca. And if you like this interview, share and subscribe to Perspectives, a journal of Canadian political economy and social democracy, on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. Thank you for joining us for this first conversation to launch Perspectives. You can read this interview and learn more about Perspectives, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca.